And say thank you for having me to talk about Victorian receptions of Cleopatra. It's a topic I have discussed previously in my book, Ancient Roman Victorian Masculinity, and in a keynote I gave, I want to say around 2021, which looked at the various forms of written and visual where Victorian readers and viewers might have encountered Cleopatra. I've put a QR code on there if you want to have a look at that talk, which is in some ways a prequel to this one. Because today I want to zone in on a particular facet, a kind of particular quirk of Victorian receptions of Cleopatra, which is her overlap with another femme fatale figure, the female vampire, in fin de siècle culture. So my first question with this paper is thinking about what we can learn about Cleopatra by viewing her alongside her kind of cultural cousin of the female vampire. And in the second half of the paper, I want to use that comparison then to start thinking about a more modern reception conundrum. It's a problem I think we ourselves have inherited from those late Victorian decades. And the question is, why out of these two figures, who, as I've said, are represented in such similar ways in the fin de siècle and have very similar discourses and ideas attached to them, why has their reception tradition diverged quite sharply when it comes to their potential for feminist or post-colonial rereadings and reimaginings? Because where the female vampire has been rewritten, reclaimed, reimagined many, many times as a figure of racial, social, gendered justice, sometimes even vengeance, as a figure of feminist and post-colonial scholarship, and even if you've seen things like What We Do in the Shadows, a figure of humour, retellings of Cleopatra have remained comparatively constrained. And so often, especially in recent news media, have focused on things like her physical appearance, her beauty, and trying to ascertain and attach meaning to the exact sort of colour of her skin, often through the lens of modern racial categories. So I want to understand some of the implications that those Victorian representations have handed down to us when we speak about Cleopatra, in ways that hopefully might gesture forward to the post-colonial panel this afternoon. So the first thing to say about both Cleopatra and the vampire is that they were both, in the fin de siècle, having a real cultural moment. They were both increasingly present and popular in the imagination. Dracula is, of course, the vampire we all think of when we think of vampires from this period, but it is surprisingly densely populated with female vampires, many of them written by women. This is my lovely slide of, as the nights start to get darker, here are some cool and interesting stories you might want to read. And the popularity of Cleopatra, as has been mentioned already, that important date, 1882, I think has to be read against the backdrop of the British occupation of Egypt, where Egypt was absorbed into the British Empire as part of what gets called a veiled protectorate. And that political situation then is fueling new waves of Egyptomania in the West, in Britain. And often those depictions of that political event focus on Cleopatra herself. So many of you will have seen this illustration before. This is how Punch magazine reports the annexation of Egypt. It's called Cleopatra Before Caesar. And it depicts that moment made famous by Plutarch where Caesar has installed himself in Alexandria and Cleopatra has herself smuggled into the palace and rolled out of a carpet or a bag at Caesar's feet. Only, if you recognise the faces here, Caesar is William Gladstone, Prime Minister William Gladstone. And so in this image, the way the logic works, Cleopatra's highly eroticized body is made analogous to Egypt itself. Quite literally there, she's labelled Egypt. So Britain's desire then, that sort of imperialist gaze, like the kind of Caesar/British desire for Cleopatra, is made analogous to British desire for empire. But just to return to my first pairing quickly, I've chosen these two images because they capture really nicely the visual and symbolic languages that I think unite Cleopatra and the vampire as femme fatales. The one on the left is an illustration, one of many illustrations from Henry Rider Haggard's novel She. No, it's not. It's from funnily enough, his novel Cleopatra from 1889. And the one on the right is an illustration. It's Philip Burne-Jones's The Vampire, which was produced as an image to accompany Rudyard Kipling's vampire poem, A Fool There Was, which, if that title sounds familiar to you, it's because it too was adapted for early cinema by kind of history's most famous vamp, if you will, possibly alongside Elizabeth Taylor, Theda Bara, whose two most famous roles, I suspect, again, not coincidentally, were The Vampire and Cleopatra. This way. There we go. So you can see the shared language in these two images even at a glance. You've got these bare shoulders and chests, the sort of eroticization of that, but interestingly always offset with quite heavy folds of drapery. So you get this image of what Bradley Dean calls the mummy wrappings of imperial striptease. There's always this kind of, it's sort of implied suggestion that these wrappings might be peeled off in that as part of that conflated sexual and territorial gaze. They're both inherently nocturnal creatures here. I really like that, the image of the bat here, the shadow of the bat, which is so present as a Gothic image and so often associated with the vampire, is here attached to Cleopatra. And part of the reason for that is that when he was researching the novel, Haggard was visiting a tomb, and he had this really frightening moment for him that he records in his autobiography, where he was sort of set upon by a load of very large bats. He had a Batman origin moment, if you will, that sort of shook him so much that he wrote it into the novel and associated that fear with Cleopatra. And there's a compositional similarity between these images as well, right? There's something about the shared dynamic of elevation and diminishing. That female elevation and power goes hand in hand with the draining or diminishing of the male counterpart, whether sexually, politically, or particularly in Kipling's case, economically, because Kipling's vampire is an economic vampire. She drains men of their fortunes. And so both Cleopatra and the vampire here are examples of, to use Bram Dijkstra's term, fantasies of feminine evil. They are figures who are meant to be desired, but then ultimately destroyed in the course of the narrative. The fantasy gets indulged in, but then that fear is violently dispelled often. And it's a model that has long been theorised by second wave, going back to second wave scholarship, by scholars like Gilbert and Gubar and Nina Auerbach, as embodying particularly misogynist fears around the new woman. But I also think Patricia Murphy's, she sort of adds on a layer on top of this, which I think is important for our understanding of Cleopatra and the vampire, because she talks about their relationship with history and who is authorised to do history. And that's significant for our purposes, because I think both Cleopatra and the female vampire, they threaten to disrupt what Victorian culture saw as a sort of masculine prerogative. After all, the vampire is by its very nature a relic of history, haunting the present. And Cleopatra, as I'll talk about in a second, I think occupies an absolutely unique point, a unique place in history as a point of imperial fear and fantasy. But just to show you in practice how similar I think are the semantics of femme fatalishness in this period, even when the vampire is couched in a Gothic mode and a text like Henry Rider Haggard's Cleopatra is couched in a sort of orientalizing classicism, I've got two literary examples here to show you. The first one, I've tried to colour code it so we can compare with the next one, but the first one is a scene you'll recognise. It's from Bram Stoker's Dracula. And it's that scene at the beginning of the novel where Jonathan Harker has been summoned to Castle Dracula. And over several days, it takes him a while because he's not the brightest spark, he starts to realise that he is in fact a prisoner there, and that he may have become the human equivalent of Deliveroo. And, sorry, I've had a lot of coffee. And he's been told not to wander into a certain part of the castle, and so naturally he goes a-wandering, and he encounters Dracula's brides. And this is how it's written. He says, "I was not alone. In the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women, ladies by their dress and manner. Two were dark, and the other was fair as fair can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. I seemed to know her face and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect at that moment how or where. All three had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear, and I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. So obviously it's a super eroticized scene. It's a sort of basic observation. But the language here, I've tried to code it, is interesting. This constant repetition of the word fair, and it happens beyond the scope of just this passage as well, but the fairness, the beauty of them. And Jonathan couches his desire for the brides here in the imagery of gemstones as well, the sapphires, the pearls, the rubies in blue. And I think that's quite significant because it obviously describes their beauty, but in a way it justifies his desire for them by suggesting that they are intrinsically beautiful, valuable, desirable. I think there's also, the gemstone imagery also has a secondary purpose that in creating that uncanny effect, because at the same time it's perhaps suggesting what we as modern readers know about the vampires, that they are hard, they are cold, they are sharp. Perhaps there's even something chthonic about that idea, like gemstones, like vampires, come from below the earth. So there's this explicit sense of the uncanny and also a sexual fear that then zones right in on the mouth, the brilliant, voluptuous lips. And in this scene, you go, well, of course it does. It's a vampire. The vampire, by the very logic of the vampire, its mouth is its sex organ, the point of penetration. And there's that sort of Lacanian, if you want to get really Lacanian about it, there's the kind of vagina dentata image of the voluptuous lips hiding the brilliant white teeth, the threat behind them. So it's exactly in line with those forms of desire and anxiety in relation to the femme fatale that Jonathan reacts to this. He says he has the longing, the burning desire, but also the deadly fear, the unease. So with all of that in mind then, I want to just have a look at this scene from Haggard's Cleopatra and how similarly these colours, these highlighted bits match up. This is a scene from the novel where the main character, Harmachis, has been summoned to Cleopatra's palace. And he's a pretender to the throne. He's trying to overthrow the Ptolemaic dynasty. And Cleopatra has summoned him here to entrap him because he's shown into her rooms where she's pretending to be asleep. And it's a similarly seductive scene that uses, as you see, almost blow for blow, the same tropes. We've got this focus on gems at the beginning and other objects of material intrinsic value, the marble, the gold, the ivory. I particularly like this idea of the statue of women's loveliness frozen into stone, because as Harmachis is shown through these various rooms towards Cleopatra, the imagery moves from these beautiful statuesque images to, a softening of her. You get her limbs become rosy, they're a soft pillow. It's almost a kind of Pygmalionist trap she's laid for him here. Again, the emphasis on her fairness, repeated all the way through. And once again, zoning in on that focus on the lips and the lines of ivory teeth behind them. So Cleopatra's not literally a vampire here, but her sexuality is, I think, symbolically working to trap and drain her enemies. I've noted in purple as well this sort of additional image that gets laid on top. The woven web of gold, the web of dark hair. There's a spiderish quality to her vampishness on top of all of this in this scene. And Harmachis reacts with the same dynamic of desire, of arousal and fear that we saw in Jonathan Harker, except Harmachis is already primed to see Cleopatra as his enemy. And so it is quite a brutal fantasy here that he jumps straight to that end point of the femme fatale fantasy, which is a desire to slay her straight away. It takes Jonathan Harker 250 pages to work up that much agency. Bless him. And so the rest of the novel is Harmachis' quest to do that. And it falls into step then with a historical timeline of Antony arriving in Egypt, of the Battle of Actium, and of what all Victorian readers would know as the eventual defeat of Cleopatra at the hands of the Roman Empire. So, having mentioned the Roman Empire there and having sort of summed up the similarities, it seems a good place to try to explain what I think then is the point of difference between these two figures. and why Cleopatra's legacy has remained weighed down by history, I think, in a way that the vampires hasn't. And it's a problem of empire. Cleopatra fought against the Roman Empire at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and she lost that battle. So from the moment of her death, the Augustan propaganda machine, through writers like Propertius and Horace, Virgil even, I think Seneca talks about her, starts to frame her relationship with Rome in ways that when you read them today, read as surprisingly kind of clearly Orientalist, in terms of the way that the language they're using is working to construct this binary of, and you can sort of see it here even in the composition of a painting like this, a rational masculine Roman West faced off against an exoticized Orientalist East. Obviously, I'm summarizing a lot of sources there. There are nuances to this, but broadly speaking, this is what we see. In that historiographical tradition, then, we never get Cleopatra's own words in a narrative form. And it's that historiographical tradition that the British Empire is drawing on in constructing its own imperial identity. It's drawing on ancient Roman models to underwrite its own authority in a way that makes Cleopatra then, as a figure of fear and fantasy, uniquely weighed down by the problem of history. Because although as a figure of imperial fear, her stand against Rome represents the moment in history where history might have gone differently, where these binaries might have been reversed. But for a British Empire with the benefit of hindsight, and if the femme fatale is composed of fear and fantasy, desire and destruction, then Cleopatra becomes a uniquely safe fantasy because history tells us that she is, unlike the female vampire, always inevitably defeated. And so in the last couple of minutes, I just want to close by looking at some of the consequences of that for receptions today. And why perhaps the vampire has been a bit more successful. There are loads of vampire stories I could have chosen to illustrate this. If you haven't seen the film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, I recommend it. It's an Iranian vampire story about a young woman vampire who sort of traverses the streets of her city. Sometimes she's on a skateboard. And she herself preys on sexual predators. And Octavia Butler's Fledgling is phenomenal and really quite challenging if you haven't come across it. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I'm conscious that I'm going a bit slower than normal because I have a migraine and I'm struggling to see my notes. So ask me about it in the questions if you want to know more. But the vampire there is a young black, I'm going to say girl, because she appears to the outside world like a 10-year-old girl. And it culminates in a phenomenal trial scene where she has to stand up in court against a sort of jury of Dracula-esque vampires and demand the justice that has been denied to her on account of her skin colour, basically, on account of her race. And I don't want to imply that Cleopatra has been entirely without kind of useful reimaginings. There are some exceptions, but I did want to end with this comic. I have a copy of it in my bag and I forgot to bring it up. But there's an exception, which I can talk a bit about later. This comic is incredibly fun. I couldn't not end with this. I found it a week or so ago. This is a very fun, it's not perfect, it's very fun. It's a very self-aware, I think, in writing against exactly the kind of late Victorian representations of the femme fatale that I've been talking about today. This is Dracula, motherfucker. It's the story of Dracula's brides. It's set in LA in the 1970s, and Dracula's brides have had enough, and they're ready to sort of do away with him and all that he stands for. So, like Butler's novel, it too is playing around with the visual language of 20th century racial representation and character, the kind of blaxploitation cinema movement, characters like Cleopatra Jones. But what struck me about this graphic novel is that it is so clearly, I think, aware on some level, consciously or not, of that relationship between the vampire and Egypt from the fin de siècle that I've been tracing today. Because it has a prologue that takes place in 1889, the same year as Haggard wrote Cleopatra, the same year as that Egyptomania. And this is how it plays out if my clicker is not going to die at exactly the wrong time. This is the opening. And what you can see here in these two panels is the brides, they kill Dracula, they turn on Dracula, and they stuff him into an Egyptian sarcophagus. That even just these two panels, a bit like the beginning, there's this lovely visual connection between the late Victorian female vampire and the ancient Egyptian world and the way the imagination kind of coalesces around these two things. But what they say explicitly, the reason why they're doing this is to strike back against empires, reigns, and marriages, these sort of pillars of patriarchy, if you will. So it's consciously or subconsciously a connection of those two femme fatales. So just to end then, it was Haggard himself who said that empires are of the imagination. They exist in storytelling, in myth-making, and so perhaps the way to unwrite them when it comes to Cleopatra, in the absence of her own historical narrative, in her own words, might be to exercise this kind of imaginative license, at least in sort of literary imaginings, might be to exercise this kind of imaginative license that the female vampire has been given over and over and over again, and imagine Cleopatra in different worlds and guises and diverse contexts. So while I didn't expect to be ending this talk on quite these terms, I'm sort of suggesting that if we want to break free of fin de siècle interpretations of imperialist Victorian legacies of Cleopatra that still seem to hem in her reception tradition, that maybe something like Cleopatra, motherfucker, might be something worth imagining. Thank you very much.